Hello everyone, this is Nikit Pelluri from Activity Hub. So, how are you? And here we are with a new series called the C tutorials. Okay, in this tutorials, we'll basically teach you the C programming language. And let me introduce myself. I'm Nikit Pelluri and a student of 9th grade. Okay, let's dive into the tutorial. So, first of all, what is programming? Programming is a way of communicating with the computers which is effective and efficient. For example, I made this presentation through PowerPoint, right? And I'm using this application called PowerPoint because someone made it, someone created it. And how did he create? Using programming. He told the computer that you should do this, you should do this when user does this, you should do this when user does that. Okay, so in this way he communicated with the computer, and that the name given to the way of communication is programming. Just like us, even programming has languages, and certain languages are Java, JavaScript, Python, etc. And there are mainly two kinds of programming languages: low level language and high level language. Low level languages are the languages that are mostly in bits, like assembly language, machine language. High level languages are written in English. I don't mean that they are purely written in English, but I mean that they are readable. They they are readable by you. For example, there will be something called for loops, and you can read that for thing, right? But when come to low level languages, they will be in bit form like 0101, and you won't understand what is happening out there. Okay, next slide. Compiler. So what is a compiler? Firstly, as I told you, there are two kinds of languages. The computer can only understand the low level language. Okay, so you will write the code in high level language because it is more convenient for us to write. So but we need a tool that converts this high level language into low level language, right? So that the computer can understand what you are writing, and that tool is called compiler. So how does the compiler work? You can mainly access the compiler through shop, and if you are using an IDE, you can use shortcuts like I will use Control Shift Build to compile a program. And through if you want to do it manually through the compiler, you can do some commands like gcc-c mod1.c, etc, etc. Okay, so how does a compiler work? Firstly, a compiler, we should specify the files that we are going to compile, and that compiler, there is something called a source file. Source file is somewhere is a file where you write all your code, and the compiler generates an equivalent object file, that is .obj extension. For Windows it is .obj, for Linux and Unix it is .o. It will convert that source file into an object file, and the compiler will convert the source file into machine code or low level language, and then it will create an object file for that machine code. Okay, then it will link all the object files. You might think, why do we have many object files? When you are working in real life, you will have thousands of source files. There will be many people working in a company, and there will be thousands of source files for one project. Hence, you will have different objects files for all those source files, right? And hence at the end, you have to link all the source files together, all the object files together, to create an executable. Executable file is a file where you can see how the program works. Like for example, Chrome is an executable, Google Chrome is an executable, because it will show how the program works. For example, if you type this, Chrome will give this. And even PowerPoint, if you do this, if you click on new slide, the PowerPoint will create a new slide. So this is how executable. Even command prompt is an executable, and any file, any program that you run is an executable. Executable is something which have .exe extension. You might be familiar with this extension, right? Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So IDE, Integrated Developer Environment. What is IDE or Integrated Developer Environment? IDE is a place where you write all your code. Okay, you need a place where you can write code effectively, efficiently, in a faster manner, and you can debug, compile, etc. You should do everything in a single place. You might think that you might think, if anyone has experience in programming and they are watching this video, you might think that I can write in a text editor and I can compile it through the terminal. Why do I need an IDE? But you definitely need an IDE because why? Because in the text editor you cannot find your errors. In the text editor you cannot debug, right? And in the text editor you cannot write the code fastly, because if you declare a variable at the top and while you're going to type the variable, if the name is very long of some variables, you have to write the whole thing, right? And there are many things like this. There are many disadvantages in writing a text editor. I mean normal text editor like MS Word or Notepad, etc. And so IDE, Integrated Developer Environment, is a place where you can write your code, compile the code, debug the code, and if you want you can edit the code. Very effective, very useful. And some of the famous IDEs are Code Blocks, Visual Studio Code, CodeLite. And mainly in this class we're gonna use Visual Studio Code. I'm using Visual Studio Code because the main advantage of using Visual Studio Code is its debugger options. Very useful debugger options. But as this is a beginner class, the debugger options will not be as much. But when you come to the advanced class, I will make one more advanced series on C tutorials, and in that I will say completely about more about debugging. But here I will just say about some things like watch window, variables window, or else call stack, etc. Okay, and even Code Blocks is a tight competitor to Visual Studio Code because it is also utilized as much as possible. Even when I was learning C, my instructor used Code Blocks. Many people say that Code Blocks give us a better user experience, but I love Visual Studio Code personally because of its interface. Okay, CodeLite is also one of the famous IDEs. Yes, we are going to use Visual Studio Code in this class. Yes, this is a screenshot of the IDE, and here I mainly of Visual Studio Code IDE. Okay, here you can see here all this place is for writing code. Here task.json, functions.h, main.c, all these are the files where we edit the code. Okay, main.c files are where you write your code. Task.json is where you configure your settings for you need to work for a project in a workspace. So for the settings of the workspace you will have some tasks, or like it just helps you to compile the code. Okay, it is a file which helps you to compile the code. And functions hedges, there are something called header files where you can write all your functions, and I will say about them in detail in the next slide. Okay, so this is the debugger. Here are various options, like you can search for something files. Here you can view all your files, and this option is for debugging. And here the debugger window opened up. Okay, here you can view this is known as variable windows, this is watch window, and this is call stack. I will say about all these things in detail. And this is you can use the debugger. Even from here you can type some expressions, you can do some evaluations or etc etc. I will tell all about all these things in detail when we go into the class, okay? And what you see is options. These are some options. This option is for continuing. This is called a breakpoint, guys. Breakpoint is where you will stop debugging, okay? And I mean pausing the debugging, and continue will continue debugging until continue running the code until a breakpoint appears. Next, this function will jump to the next line, so you will go just one line front, and this will step you into the function, and this will help you to step out of a function, and this will help you to this function, this green one is there, right? This will help you to restart the function, restart the debugging, and this will help you to end the debugging, okay? So I hope you got some idea about the interface of Visual Studio Code. So let's move on to the next slide, okay? So why C? Why should I start with C? C is one of the most widely used and popular programming languages. Anyone who has an experience in C or in any other programming language would recommend you to start with C. Why? It gets you familiar with some of the most fundamental concepts, because most programming languages are made from C. It is one of the oldest language. Even you have heard about the term called C++, right? C++, you might just think C++ is a sequel of C, okay? Half of the C++ or 75% of the C++ is mainly based on C, and there is something called C11 standard, guys, and I will talk about standards. But C11 standard was a new type of compilers which were introduced in 2011. A new type of compilers which were introduced in 2011 were called as C11. In C99 means a new set of compilers which were introduced in 1999. C89, they were introduced in 1989. I mean, they are advanced versions, and C89 is mostly the most popular one, because C99 and C11 do not support to all those things. But C11, guys, it has a very good feature that it can almost compile your code. You can even write C++ code in the C11. I mean, it supports C++ too. I mean, not every time, but most of the time it supports C11, okay? But we're gonna use C89 compiler, but sometimes I would also, when I use some things from C99 or C11, I would say that, okay? Next, after learning C, it will be much easier to learn other programming languages like Java, Python, etc. As I said, most languages are made from C and they are very useful. And even some concepts like dynamic memory allocation and pointers and all these things are not present in most of the languages, but they are present in C. So they will get you a better actually they will help you to become a better programmer. For example, in Java you don't need to free the memory, but while using the dynamic memory allocation in C, you have to free the memory, okay? So C helps you to get familiar with some of the most fun and most important and fundamental concepts of the programming languages. Because once you learn one language, in the next language, if there are any new concepts, you should learn them. Otherwise, you should just learn what is the syntax of that language, because the concepts are already in your mind. You should just know the syntax, right? So knowing the syntax would help you learning very easy, and starting with C will help you to get a better hold of all those languages. I hope you are clear. And how do you create a C program? You can create a C program in the following steps. I mean, everyone would start with writing the code, but I would personally suggest, even my instructor said the same thing to me, you should before writing the code, first take a sheet of paper and design your program. Like, I should enter this. For example, there is a there is a challenge for you which states that you should print all the prime numbers from 1 to 100. And how do you do that? First you should write down the problem on a sheet of paper. What is your goal? Printing prime numbers from 1 to 100. And then how do you do that? That you would understand how to design the code. You would understand once you start writing the code, and you wouldn't understand now if I say all those things. Okay, yes, first you should understand, like you should know what I'm going to write, what I'm not going to write, what I'm going to write, how it is going to write. And for example, let me say this, because I cannot even though you don't, and most of you don't understand this, I have to say this, because if I move on to the next one, the designing will be, I don't feel good that I explained in a better manner. There is something called loops. Okay, loops nothing but they will repeat your code. First, to print all those prime numbers, first I had an outer loop which will have one number, and I had in the next an inner loop which will check first. For example, in the outer loop I had a number 1, and in the inner loop, okay, don't take 1, take it as 6. I will take it as 6, and in the inner loop I will check from 1 to 100 every number 1 to 100, and every number, if the remainder by dividing the outer loop, that means 6. Here take this 3, take it 3. Okay, so if 6 divided by 3's remainder is equal to 0, then it is not a prime number, so don't print it. If it is a 6 divided by 3's remainder is not 0, it is a prime number, and print it. Yes, I mean it's not a prime number, and I know it. Next one is writing your code. Just and once you design, go and write the code according to your design and compile the program, that is creating an executable, and run your code in the executable file. And then you will get some errors in the code, right? There are mainly two kinds of errors: compiler error, functionality error. Compiler error are the errors which will not create an executable, and the compiler will report them. Functionality errors are the errors which will create an executable, and the compiler will not report them, but your program will not work as you expect. Okay, and then test your code, how clear all your bugs. Debug the code, and then recompile it. If you still get errors, go and modify them again. And maintain and modification of the program. Maintain and modification of a program means you should maintain it properly so that you will understand what you did in the future. And modification of the code means adding new features to your program. You should maintain it properly, because in the future you can understand what you wrote in the past, right? And modify it should be easier to modify the code. If you wrote the code correctly but in a bad manner, you cannot modify it, you cannot maintain it properly. Hence, these are the steps. And thank you guys, it was a wonderful session so far, and I think this series will be super successful. And yeah, the link to these slides will be in the description. If they are not, check after a couple of hours after the uploading of the video. And yes, thank you guys. It was a wonderful session with you. This is signing off, Activity Hub.